staff in 1973 with the responsibility of developing marriage education program. I had done some study in adult education, which was a sort of new developing concept at that time. And both of us had trained as marriage counsellors with Family Life previously, and were working part-time, or really in a voluntary capacity as counsellors, and John offered me the job.
Ian and I trained together, and that was an interesting experience. It was the first combined agencies training in Australia, I think, in Sydney anyway. And we were both accepted, which was great, because we did this massive psychological test first with, for some reason, a Carillion practice at the same time at now I can't think of the name of the church.
I was a Baptist minister working in a housing commission area in Green Valley, and surrounded by broken marriages in effect, and I became really aware of the fact that I didn't have a clue what the hell I was doing, trying to be helpful, and there was the opportunity to train as counsellors, which would have been simply to work maybe 1 or 2 nights a week as counsellors and continue with our ordinary jobs.
I didn't have a job at the time other than minister's wife and 3 kids.
Yeah, which fairly busy.
Yes, but I was an OT, occupational therapist, and so I had a background in working with people and was just as interested as you were in doing the counsellor training, and really glad to have the opportunity.
Indeed it did.
Yes, because it was focused on dysfunction in those days rather than on possibilities, and it was really early days. So the training was weird. It was really more human potential training, awareness training, etc.
And really encounter low-level encounter group.
Yes. And the techniques we learned, which were sort of active listening up to a point. I can remember one fight where, I don't know which one of us said it, but whoever tried to do the active listening was not received by the other person, because one of us said, "Don't you counsel me." Yes.
But on the other hand, there were some real pluses that came from that, because we did get some vision through that, which later, of course, was much more developed through the marriage enrichment program. But we got some vision of maybe you could relate more deeply, or maybe you could move to having some real appreciation of the other person as a person, as distinct from being a marriage partner. Both of us, whilst we were in the ministry, we also, one of the appeals about Family Life was that it was not denominationally identified. It was in those days fairly overtly Christian, but specifically not denominationally identified, which was a plus from our point of view.
And I think you actually had a contact with John Robson, and you had referred a couple.
Yeah, no, that's right.
From the church at Green Valley, and you were impressed with what he was able to do with that marriage.
Yeah,
and you had lectures a couple of lectures at college.
Two lectures,
John.
I think, only by John at college, and I was profoundly impressed. Actually, you're quite right. That was probably one of the sort of foundational pieces in the whole jigsaw.
I think he was a visionary as far as human relations went.
Yeah, but it was that he had real integrity as a person is probably... I sort of sensed that what I saw was what I got, and he was profoundly effective in connecting with me. I sort of felt this guy, I've got his complete attention, and he's doing his best to understand me. It was exciting because the government had made this really quite extraordinary decision to invest funds in marriage counselling, which was I think was a world first. I'm not sure about that, but I think it was. So that was a big opportunity, and although at that time there was no funding for marriage education, and by marriage education here we mean preparation for marriage. The idea of education post-wedding came much later in the process, but John had the vision to develop that program of marriage education. And let's do this a bit better. It had already been running at a very low level, and John saw the potential for that to grow. And the only sort of preparation for marriage that was being done at that time were just an interview almost at the last minute by the minister who was going to marry the couple, and John reckoned that was much too little, much too late, and let's see if we couldn't do something a bit more expansive. And that program received almost immediate public response. It was quite extraordinary how popular that program became, and that really was right down my alley from my point of view. I was really interested in marriage, in adult education. I was really interested in the concept of trying to do some preparation beforehand rather than muck around afterwards. The whole idea of being able to actually learn something about this business of marriage, that all sort of really appealed to me.
That took a while before that happened, because what had been existing before was the education work that father and son and mother and daughter welfare movement were doing. So the name change came probably around about the time that the counselling really got going to family life movement, and it was an incredibly exciting time. My recollection was that everybody was very dedicated, whoever they were, whether that was on the front desk or whether that was the staff who were part-time, who initially were not being paid. And the expansion happened really with Bill Shelley being put on the staff, who was an American ex-priest who was married. Bill was an inspiration, and I think he was the first employee on the marriage counselling side, and he was an absolute inspiration. He also encouraged me personally in developing my therapeutic skills, and we ran a Gestalt group together. again, with not being paid, and I did as much counselling as I could on top of that because I needed to qualify with the numbers of hours that I did. But really, everybody did more than, could have been expected of them. And it was an exciting time, very exciting, because worldwide, or rather English-speaking world maybe, particularly coming from America, following the human potential movement in the 40s, just everybody's knowledge was expanding of what could happen when people were freed to be themselves, to learn about themselves, to be more aware of other people, and to get out of the old mode of blinkered living in your place where you were put. So we then headed, during the time we were there, we had been through the 60s, we'd been through the sexual revolution, we'd been through a fair few things by then, and I think we rode on the back of that in a way that with a goal of just making life easier and better and work better for people.
Well, Gerlinda has mentioned Bill, and I would support everything she said. He was another remarkable person who I can remember John saying to me, he's an ex-Catholic priest, is that okay with you? And of course it was, but Bill was one of these people who just was an absolute living inspiration of, a living example of the sort of stuff that he was on about. And he himself had undergone quite some extensive training in the US. I'm not sure if you have any detail about that. But he was much more, he had an interesting combination because he was much more professional than John in his whole manner, and yet he was also even more personally focused. So that was he was really a very remarkable man, and he was a great support. Gerlinda talked about him encouraging her in her Gestalt development. I could talk about the same sort of thing in the marriage counselling side of the deal, where Bill said, here we are as a sex education organisation and we know nothing about sex in marriage. We really need to develop this. And he formed a small group amongst the staff, David Rockwell and myself and Bill, to really start to learn something about sex therapy and sex relationships in marriage, which later became my real area of interest. So from my point of view, Bill and John, who you need to remember that at this time, John made the first of what were either 2 or 3 trips overseas at the expense of the organisation to study what was going on in marriage education, marriage counselling and sex education right around the world. And John came back absolutely alive with ideas and with a whole bunch of personal contacts, the most famous of whom would have been Virginia Satir. John visited these people, and the Masons, of course. John visited these folk overseas and then subsequently ran workshops in Australia and brought these people out to Australia. And so Family Life hit the headlines as the people who were entrepreneurial and bringing these world names to Australia. And John was incredibly successful at that, not so successful financially, but sort of from the point of view of putting Family Life on the map, there was no question about that. So we had the opportunity to do, free of charge, training with a whole series of them.
Carl Broadbent.
Broderick.
Broderick, rather.
Yep.
Carl Broderick, Herb Zeroff. That was the first introduction to marriage enrichment.
Yep. But Virginia Satir was the big name, but I'm trying to think, one of the... doesn't really matter. I can't... But so what happened was that we, Family Life, ran these workshops and invited staff from the other marriage counselling organisations to come and guess what? We got the kudos, so it was an exciting time.
Oh, very exciting. We did quite a bit of, we and the other agencies answered questionnaires because we were funded by the government, we were accountable. And I think they usually were that a third of the people who came were really satisfied and went on to have the tools to keep going well. That another third were better off, but not as successful as that, and another third probably their marriages failed or they gave up. And that stayed pretty constant, I think.
Was fairly
I think personally we had some amazing success with some couples and individuals, and others where we didn't. I can remember, that's not a success story, when we were still at Petersham in the lovely old house there, and I had a little office on the veranda. I had a couple where the husband obviously these days would be immediately regarded as domestic violence type person, perpetrator, and he actually came on his own, that's right, to try and get his wife back, and I couldn't deliver, so he then came back and broke in during the night and trashed the offices. So that was fairly dramatic. At that stage we were not doing couple interviews, we saw them individually, and as we used to say, Rogerised them around, used Carl Rogers' technique to really understand them, etc., and to explore what's happening for them, etc. And that couple came for 18 interviews, alternately, and sent me, and she wrote a very long letter of thanks at the end. I wasn't even sure that sort of really went on together because I never saw them together. So that was a bit touching. It didn't take terribly long before we started seeing people together, but John hadn't seen a model of that. There were none of the things were developed of understanding how that works and how to make that work and so on. So we were right on the beginning of all that. But we've got friends who became friends because we shared in their marriages, and then they did some of the courses, and then they came on the team for the courses that I was running towards the end, and whose lives, who just wouldn't be together, or whose lives would not be as fulfilled as they
One of the most interesting techniques that was developed, that was a little bit later, but was the idea of a constructive separation, where couples, where they chose to separate with the idea of coming back together again, but giving themselves some space to sort out some issues for themselves, and then and maybe to have a look at their relationship a bit from the outside. And we're still very close friends with a delightful young couple who came.
Oh yes.
And worked with me for a while, and she was the daughter of a fairly prominent minister, Christian minister, and the decision that they would separate fairly soon after coming to see me was didn't go down too well, as you can imagine, because that was seen as perhaps.
Well, you certainly failed at that point.
I failed at that point. The young couple were totally different. They were saying, this is the best thing that's ever happened. Forget about my parents, just let's work on this. And they are still very good friends, and they're made a cracker job of their marriage.
Actually, they became marriage enrichment leaders.
Yes, they did.
And preparation for marriage leaders.
That's right. Yeah. And that's the. We had another couple, and I had another couple who came from Gaimea who came as clients who subsequently became marriage education leaders. So the answer is yes, and not too many that would. I'm just suddenly thinking of a couple in our church at present where they.
Gosh, they came to you about, what, 30 years ago?
Yeah, long time ago.
Years.
But I've got two couples. One, they had separated and came for counselling, and he had been playing around fairly badly, and they managed to put that together. And the couple that you were referring, who came not very long ago to our church and rocked up to me and said, "Hey, we came to your marriage preparation program, remember us?" No is the answer, but yeah.
Well, they're certainly very grateful still.
Yeah. So I guess really what I wanted to say was that there was really adequate success to be able to say, hey, this is really worthwhile doing. Gerlinda and I were amongst a group of 80 people who applied to train as marriage counsellors for it was a combined group, so that was the Anglicans, Methodists and Family Life that
and
worked.
Catholic.
Oh, right.
Yep.
With the Catholic.
There was a
right.
Catholic.
Yeah, oh, that's right. Now, amongst that 80, from that 80 they chose 18, and of those 18, only 8 completed the training. And Bill said, this is...
That's for our agency.
Yeah. Bill said, this is an absolute disaster. Let's do something better about selecting. So on the staff, on the board at that time, we had a clinical psychologist, Jeff Fox, who was all into selection.
Psychological profiles.
Psychological profiling and selection. So he developed a psych profile for marriage counsellors by interviewing all the people who were on the staff at that time and all the
and running us all through a battery of tests.
And also some from some of the other agencies. And Bill, the remarkable thing was he said that the profile was extremely consistent with those of us who had A, completed the training, and B, were enjoying doing the counselling. So, with that as a background, Bill then implemented that selection process. So, from the first group of people who trained using that technique, they chose 10, and 9 of them graduated.
Quite a number of the people who applied for counsellor training with us had a psych degree and realised that they didn't have the wherewithal to use it in a practical sense. So that was interesting and challenging because we didn't have psych degrees. But they needed to pitch in with everybody else who maybe was only a housewife or whatever, who had the right profile and had the possibility of learning how to do it.
Joan Perrott, who was Director of Marriage Guidance Council at that time, phoning me up on one occasion and talking about the fact that she'd just had a series of interviews. They were trying to employ some more counsellors, and she'd had several interviews with people who had psych qualifications, and she said, I sat them down in front of a video camera and said, so what I want you to do is to role play an interview with a couple and we'll look at that. And
but they had a role play couple,
yeah,
and they did the counselling.
Yeah, that's right. And these people said, but I've never interviewed a couple. What do you expect me to do? And they were applying for work as counsellors. And Joan said they were absolutely hopeless, not surprising, because they'd never actually done the job. So, back to your question, the short answer was that any training that was available was absolutely theoretical, involved no face-to-face training at all, whereas the work that we were doing, and the other agencies too, was all based on role-playing face-to-face from day one, really. So each trainee had to come with their own videotape, and from day one, and we just started videotaping.
Yeah, we started videotaping very early. One of the things that helped, I think, and perhaps that's not so interesting for what you want, but in terms of the counsellor training, was that there was a lot of exploration of how that worked, both with individuals and with couples. There was a guy who made a big contribution because he developed a technique of breaking down the skills that were needed in an interview in response to certain things happening. So micro skills training became your particular thing at that time. When it came to the training for everybody who worked for Family Life in the end, whether it was educators, group leaders, counsellors, mediators, was a course we called Developing Skills in Communicating and Relating, which was based on the work of Gerard Egan, who, following that micro skills discovery, then put that into a course for people to learn to communicate with each other. So taking them through, first of all, self-awareness, then learning how to actually listen and reflect to the other person, then going on to develop deeper level communication skills, etc. Now that was a pre-training course in the end, which was a requirement for anybody working, whether they were on staff or whether there were sessional people, and it was 6 months, wasn't it? Yep. 6 months, 1 night a week,
one
with 2 weekends in it. One was an awareness weekend at the beginning, and a therapy weekend at the end. And I used to do a lot of those therapy weekends, so that people became more aware of their own issues and therefore didn't get them mixed up with the client's issues.
There was a big emphasis on the staff having worked on their own relationship, and so there was great encouragement for counsellors, for example, to come with their partners to marriage enrichment programs.
That's after the initial courses where we finished up with a whole lot of divorces.
Yep.
Because the reason they wanted to become a marriage counsellor was that their marriage wasn't so hot. So
we were there, when we joined the staff, we were in Sydney only.
In the city only.
And even
Goulburn Street.
Specifically in Goulburn Street, and that was it. Nothing else outside. So the regional development was interesting because that became possible through federal government funding, initially under the Marriage Act and then later under Family Law Act. The government was keen to foster marriage counselling services in regional centres, but the Marriage Guidance Council had regionalised a bit ahead of us, and so they had centres largely in the southern part of the state, so we had that sort of tacit agreement with
we went north.
We went north, and we weren't going to get funding if we went south, but if we went north, we were.
Apart from Gaimea, That was before the expansion, wasn't it?
No,
The funding for Gaimeer?
No.
No. Okay.
No, that
Doesn't matter.
all came. And the first one of those was at Coffs Harbour. First regional centre was at Coffs Harbour, which Bill was largely responsible for establishing. And then I was responsible for Lismore. Oh, and we had just Bill had just made some inroads into Dubbo and had run an initial training experience of some sort at Dubbo. But the interesting thing was that we didn't have any difficulty attracting people, local people, who were keen to train. I mean, initially we had to run training. We had to find a group of people who were interested and then run some training.
Some pre-training courses. So that's when we started running the Egan courses.
Yep. And then from that group, ultimately select somebody who would be able to function as a regional manager in that. So all the regional managers were councillor trained, and Lismore, but that was an absolute find because Jenny Bolton had trained with Marriage Guidance Council, and she and Graham were keen to move to Lismore, but there was no way she was going to be able to work for MGC in Lismore, and we had made it known that we were keen on getting something established in Lismore, which she heard about and came to see me and said, I'm available, I'm trained, I want to go and work. So we had an immediate rapport, Jenny and I said, yep, you'll do the job. So, and Jenny was responsible for setting that up. It became really a very lively,
very effective centre. She was also into group work.
She was very competent. And later she went back to university, completed her degree.
You ran training at Bathurst, didn't you? Bathurst.
Yeah. But in sequence, Coffs was first, Dubbo second, Lismore third, and Newcastle came much later in the process.
What about Orange and Bathurst?
Orange and Bathurst, we never had a presence there other than a counselling.
Yeah, it wasn't a regional centre.
Yeah, we had counsellors working there in church halls and various fairly unsatisfactory arrangements. We also had a centre at Gosford, which had mixed fortunes
I went to Gosford. I drove to Gosford for 2 years.
Long time. Because of the isolation and the need for confidentiality, that people would go from Orange to Parkes for counselling and from Parkes to Orange, but the Parkes people didn't go to the centre in Parkes, which was I thought that was interesting.
Not a problem at Dubbo.
No, not at Dubbo. It was big enough, yeah.
So, do you think that people in regional areas at that stage were more reluctant to go to counselling because they worried about people knowing their business?
You're quite right. It was a far more acceptable thing in the city than in the country, and I think that sort of was partly, the general perception that country people may be a bit more conservative generally, which wasn't true in Lismore and in Coffs, both of which were fairly alternate by that time. Lismore especially was a fairly alternate group. We had some fascinating clients in both of those places.
Yes, quite a big alternate community, particularly.
Yep.
Well, from both. Yes.
From both.
One of the interesting things organisationally was that when we needed to become more, more sort of structured. I'm trying to remember, when did we get? Did we already have a CEO when we got that dreadful finance manager?
Yeah, yeah.
What was his name?
John.
John was a very conservative accountant, I think, and came on the staff when we were trying to get our act together more on the business side of things, which we never did well, I don't think. Councillors are not the best at that, and all our staff were councillors. And John, in his efforts to raise funds for the organisation, came up with bright ideas, for one thing, to shorten the counselling hour so that we could see more clients in one day, which actually we weren't allowed to do under our funding, so that you would chop off 10 minutes off each counsellor and then you fit another lot in and you get that much more money. That was my fight at that stage. I was in charge of counselling. But he also tried to set region against region in competition. And that for a while was very, very uncomfortable because our regional managers felt terribly pressured by that. And in a sense, he was setting people against each other who had to have a trust relationship, because quite often the regional manager from one area was the supervisor for the counselling for the other regional manager. So you really need to be absolutely open and, being able to trust each other. And he was fostering, and we couldn't work out for a little while what was going on, but that really was the essence of that. So that had to be stopped. And really, in the end, he had to be stopped. He didn't quite fit. He was a lot better once his niece came to one of our groups. I developed some groups for people with low self-esteem, and they were really sort of self-esteem and assertiveness groups. They were called Discovery 1, 2 and 3. And his niece did the Discovery 1 course, and her life was transformed, and suddenly he approved of groups financially, so even though they didn't always make money. Yeah, we had some crazy challenges like that, didn't we, when our little world was sort of interrupted.
I just remembered something that we bypassed altogether. One of the things that really marked the organisation completely was a great sense of mutual appreciation and support and understanding. And that was largely fostered, partly obviously through the selection of staff, particularly regional managers and so on. But something that may surprise you, at this time, for most of the time that Gerlinda and I were working there, we would have had about 60 or 70 part-time counsellors. So these were people who were being paid really very little, but giving us 2 evenings a week or something like that in all the, across all the regions and so on. So once a year we ran an annual workshop, a training experience over a weekend, and brought them all to Sydney, and we would have maybe 50, 60 folk, and run in-service training, which we mostly did using some of the specialist people that we had on staff to do that.
Or some imports?
Yep, yeah, or maybe special, people, current experts who were available in Sydney or something like that. Now, that was a wonderful experience and was a great team-building thing.
Well, if I can just add to that, the way they were usually run was that there was some input, and then we were in groups of 3 or 4 or whatever, actually putting it into practice, so that people needed to share their own feelings in a real area of their life quite often, which meant that they got to know each other at a very deep level, and there was a very strong fellowship built up. And not only for the group leaders, because there was also
not only for counsellors, but also group leaders.
Group leaders had a separate workshop, and there would have been about 50 of those.
And then eventually the educators. The counsellors were first, and then the group leaders, and then the educators.
Yeah, so we ran workshops, annual workshops.
Those folk gave up a whole weekend to
and travelled from the country.
And travelled from the country, mostly at their own expense. To participate in that. family life occupied the first floor above a carpet warehouse in Goulburn Street in the city. There were 3 counselling rooms, and John had an office and a printing press out the back, which John's wife Irene ran to print the flyers for the for the sex education programs in schools, and the educators had a little sort of workplace at the back, and there were 2 full-time educators. We were in on a first floor above a carpet warehouse in Goulburn Street, and there was 3 counselling rooms and an office and a little reception desk in a tiny, tiny little place you had to sort of crawl past to get down the passageway. And the educators, 3 educators, they were working mostly 3 nights a week out the back, and a printing press which Irene ran, offset press. She was printing the flyers that went out to advertise the school program. And there was John and Phil, who had started just a few weeks, filled out just a few weeks before me, and myself, and a receptionist, and that was it.
And by the time you left?
Yeah. And then fairly soon after that, Bill...
Darling, by the time we
Sorry.
left, what
Oh,
was it
and
like?
when we left, I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. So when we left, we had regional centres in Lismore, Coffs Harbour, Dubbo, Newcastle, Gymea. That's all. We had a crew of about 70 counsellors, part-time counsellors. On the staff, we had Phil Dart, myself, Noel Cathcart, you.
Not when we left.
No,
left
Noel
before.
had left, that's right.
That was
and
Faye
Jill,
Reid.
and
Faye Reid was in charge of education.
And was Jill? No, Jill had left too, but at the height of the operation we had Jill and Noel and Faye and yourself as full-time people, and then we had full-time regional managers in each of the centres.
And we had secretaries.
And we all
I had 1.5 secretaries.
Yeah.
It was great.
And I wish I could remember the figures, but I can't, and it would not be good, but we were talking about multiple thousand hours of counselling annually.
Let alone group leading.
What a legacy.
We were pretty worried because we'd become mum and dad, you know. And what do you do with that in terms of succession and so on? And it didn't work too well afterwards straight away. And we were not involved in, because we were staff, we were not involved in selection of people to come afterwards, or even in selection of some of the regional managers who failed dramatically just before we left. So that was a downer, but we tried to ensure that it all went on, but then I think whoever moved in decided things needed to change and chopped and changed, which destroyed a lot of what was going on, but maybe let new stuff happen, I don't know.
So
I didn't go on. I didn't know I was invited to go on the then board, and I wasn't going to. It would have been too disastrous to see what was happening.
The feeling of cohesion and of respect and support that existed really right across the board. What about you?
And I would have added to yours the enormous amount of skills training that you did and the equipping of so many people to a very high professional standard.
Yeah. The things that I think became really, you could sort of note them carefully. These were the things that were important. The selection, we really worked hard at selecting staff at the beginning. We worked hard at training them, and we worked hard at supporting them. Those were the things that I think were the hallmarks of what we did.
What sort of culture do you think that you created within the organisation?
I think one very much of mutual respect and genuine concern for each other. We had some staff times away, which we didn't mention, where that was an opportunity to do a bit of ironing out of difficulties with each other or differences with each other. And I think we were pretty good at establishing that. I'm thinking in terms of what did I leave behind. Probably a parallel thing in the group leading area. Left behind a whole way of ensuring that people were supported, because that was in the end my job, to look after this web of support, so many supervision sessions per group, so many, etc., etc. And some of that continued for quite some time. And a legacy which we haven't mentioned really was that a number of courses that I designed and led with another co-therapist on the weekend, and Ian and I led them in the end, which we called the Christian Growth courses, which were designed to help people who had fallen by the wayside in terms of support from their churches, or were sort of on the point of giving up any faith they had because of the difficulties in their lives. And they really were part of a series of courses that were in vogue at that time, a version of self-transformational courses. And I think by supporting me in doing that, which was largely Ian and Phil supporting me financially to see that those courses continued, we really had a healing ministry to a huge number of people. The courses were large. They were between 40 and 50 in each course. I had a team of volunteers who we still meet with twice a year, some of them, who were volunteer people to support those people. And in the end, I would think that probably about a third of the group, if not more, had severe trauma and sexual abuse.
Yep.
So that they were actual therapeutic courses. We had a very heavy weekend, which was 35 hours straight, and that was part of the transformational process, etc. So I think that's one thing that I look back on, that with the support of family life we were able to do.
And that support included support from the board, because you had
Yes.
Bruce Peterson.
Yeah.
That, by the way, that's another name that should be, up there in lights, because Bruce and John Robson were great friends to start with, but Bruce, of course, was a very, very well-known psychiatrist in Sydney. At his funeral, somebody said Bruce would go down as Sydney's, what was the word? My favourite psychiatrist. And he was really a very important, wise person, slightly in the background, but very articulate and very aware of important issues that might otherwise get lost. John was an absolute enthusiast, and sometimes his enthusiasm sort of took him away a bit, and I think the same might be said about us, but Bruce was sort of standing in the background.
Alan Craddock was another person who made
Alan,
a huge contribution to
Alan also.
particularly the counselling service.
The only old-timer that we would really know
We're the old timers.
was John Robson. And a couple of stories that I remember him telling me. And unfortunately, I only have these in very summary form, but they include the fact that the movement's first, so that we're talking here about father and son
Yes.
movement, before mother and daughter incorporated, just father and son. There was in fact a public burning ceremony in the domain.
Oh.
No, I think it was the domain,
Right.
one public place, of the first publication, which was banned by the postal service and couldn't be transmitted through the post because it was obscene. So that's quite a fun story. And the other interesting thing that might be lost track of was that I told you about the Goldman Street premises. The reason we moved from Goldman Street was because the carpet place downstairs, the carpet warehouse, went up in smoke. And because
Flames, actually.
and yes, the carpet guy was bankrupt and set fire to the carpet place, and we were sitting above him. So
Melted phones and
melted
it
phones
was just
and-
chaos. All the records and stuff. Oh,
It was
most of those
quite,
were okay.
quite extraordinary. Came in with
Everything
cables
covered
hanging
in
down
water.
from the roof. And, yeah. So that was also an exciting event.
Where did you move to?
That's what I think we moved to Petersham from there, didn't we?
Petersham
Yes.
from there,
To
which
lovely
was
old house.
a gorgeous old home. John carpeted.
With dreadful shag carpet upstairs
well, the
in the
reason-
group room.
Yeah,
because
the
it was-
reason was he went
was
to
free.
auctions and bought bits of carpet, and every room had a different carpet in it. It was quite chaotic. And the group, it was a lovely old building, and for the first time we had, of course, a group room, a room that was
Upstairs,
big enough,
which was lovely,
yeah,
yes.
which was lovely. But it had the most awful.
Orange and cream and brown flecked shag carpet about this deep.
Was really was the pit. So what else can I think?
We had a lot of fun on some of the staff weekends. I remember one where actually Faye, Reid and I, acting like kids, decided to hide for the next session. And Phil came looking for us everywhere, which highly amused us. I think we felt about 5 years old. Faye would probably remember that.
In Strathfield, I had a client. We had a lovely premises at Strathfield, so that was one up from Lewisham.
Oh, huge great room.
A beautiful big group room, and we really moved there because Strathfield was no longer big enough.
Petersham was no longer.
Lewisham, Petersham was no longer big enough, but it had a little toilet just near the front door, immediately inside the front door.
Under the stairs.
Yes, under the stairs. And I had a client who was really very dysfunctional. She had been very badly sexually abused as a child. And I worked with her for more than a year on weekly sessions, and at one stage those sessions involved quite a degree of regression, and so when the hour came to an end she really wasn't in a fit state to go home, or to drive anyway. So she discovered this toilet just near the front door and used to exit the counselling room and go and lock herself in the toilet, which was...
To recover.
To recover, which was fine, except that some of us needed to close the building up and go home. And trying to get her out of the toilet and at the same time sort of be respectful of the fact that she really was a client and was in quite a mess. But that was a bit of a problem. She caused quite a turmoil for the staff. And we had
just lock up the building and go home. I thought that you could tell me that she ended up being locked in overnight.
We also had a most gorgeous receptionist secretary at Strathfield, Jo, who.
Well, she came from Goulburn Street with us.
Yeah,
she started at Goulburn Street at the age of 17.
She was a really lovely young woman.
She was a real bogan.
Yep. But she came, and she came from
Green
Valley. And she was really an excellent receptionist, but she also understood the situation, so she would handle very distressed clients ringing in on the phone wanting to make an appointment, and she would be really very patient and excellent. Her telephone manner was excellent.
And her telephone voice was very educated.
And then she would put down the receiver and say, "You're a stupid old bat, and what you really need to do is to do X, Y, and Z."
Well, one time I was there, she put the phone down where somebody had been really difficult and put the phone down and said, "Aren't I nice?" Yes, she would actually, she was a bit of a pressure cooker. She would over-service everybody and then have to do her own work that she should have been doing at work at home. And then eventually she would implode and get into a rage and explode until Manton was great at handling her. Now I've lost what I was going to say. Yes. I used to do two things with her. I used to play Ain't It Awful with her, which is a game, and where you try to feel better by saying how bad it is, etc. And I'd get her going until she could laugh about it. But her big complaint from time to time was, "I'm just a mushroom." I'd say, "What does that mean, Jo?" "Fed on shit and in the dark, and everybody expects me to know everything."